In this video, I want to look at a theory of currency sovereignty, which is really just another way of saying modern money theory. When we look back at that story of what money is, that traditional idea of where money comes from and what it is, what we see is that that's really just a story. It's derived from a thought experiment in which you sit back in your recliner and ask yourself, well, where would money come from if we started with an economy that didn't have money, a barter economy? And that story really doesn't have much support in the actual historical record. When we look to the actual historical record, what we see is that the evolution of institutions of money really suggests a very different idea of what money is altogether. What we see is the actual historical record suggests that money is fundamentally a credit-debt relationship, an IOU. So what does it mean to say money is an IOU? What we essentially mean is that the value of money derives not from the intrinsic value of the gold or whatever the money is actually made of, but from the fact that it is generally accepted in payment for goods and services and in the retirement of debt. And what this tells us is, to some extent, anyone can actually create money by writing up an IOU, but the question becomes, will anybody accept that IOU? This view aligns pretty closely with Keynes's insight on money and interest. What distinguishes money from bonds? Well, of course, they're both essentially pieces of paper, but a bond pays an interest rate, whereas money does not. At the same time, though, a bond is less liquid than money. Recall that Keynes argued that interest is the reward for parting with liquidity, and money gives no interest, but it's the most liquid of any financial instruments. That is, it's the easiest to turn into something else, to settle a debt, to buy goods and services, or to invest in some other financial instruments like a bond. And this is ultimately what gives money its value. Money has value not because of its intrinsic value, the gold it's made out of or what have you, but because simply it's widely accepted for payments. So this credit-debt relationship preceded money in the actual historical record as a medium of exchange. People created credits and retired debts and kept track of all that long before common currencies came about. And banks, incidentally, didn't develop to store commodity money either. We don't actually see the first banks developing to store your gold coins in its vault. Banks actually developed to clear debts. And then, of course, in modern times, we have central banks on top of that to clear the debts between the private banks. So up until now, we've only really looked at money as an IOU in terms of private actors, individuals, banks, firms, and so forth. But what we really need is to understand money as a creature of the state, because real currencies today are generally tied to some governments. And the reason for that is that governments have unique powers that private actors don't. So again, what we need is a theory of sovereign currencies. These are national and non-redeemable currencies. So a currency that isn't guaranteed to be tradable for a certain quantity of, say, gold. This would apply to, say, the US dollar or the Japanese yen or the British pound or the Canadian dollar or what have you. This theory would not apply to, say, the state of Oregon or the country of Greece, because neither of these two political entities issue their own currencies. So where do, for instance, dollars come from? Well, you've already seen that banks can create money from thin air, so to speak, by making loans, but these aren't exactly dollars. They operate as essentially dollars, but they're not quite an actual dollar. Proper dollars can only come from one place, the federal government's. And of course, the Secret Service is responsible for stopping anybody else who tries to create dollars, because that's considered counterfeiting. So how then does the federal government create dollars? Well, it does it simply by issuing the dollars, and it issues those dollars by spending. You can think of this as the government prints up dollar bills and then pays people in exchange for goods and services with those dollar bills, but really this is all going on electronically now through crediting bank accounts. In any case, what we're looking at is the federal government of the United States as a sovereign currency issuer. It is the creator of its currency, the dollar. This is sort of like writing an IOU. In fact, it's exactly like writing an IOU, but with a caveat. The government doesn't actually promise to repay anything other than the note itself, other than the dollar itself. So really, the dollar, and this would be true of the pound for the UK or the yen for Japan and so on, but in the case of the United States, the dollar is an IOU where the I, the government, doesn't actually owe you anything. And that, of course, begs the question, why would I ever actually agree to sell the government something in exchange for these IOUs in which nothing is actually owed? And the answer to that question is quite interesting, I think. The basic answer is because the government taxes in dollars. Essentially, the federal government can say to you, either you give me dollars, which ultimately you can only get by selling things to me, or I'll put you in jail. Thus, taxes don't finance government spending. In fact, they simply destroy the currency. But the tax obligation makes those IOUs that the government issues generally acceptable. This is why economists working in the modern money theory tradition say that taxes drive money. They create the general acceptability of the government's dollars, allowing the government to access and control resources by issuing its own currency, by issuing those dollars.